Welcome to the Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, where every death had a life and every life had a story. My name is Jennie Johnson.
Hello, and I'm Diane Hartshorn, and I can hardly contain my excitement of our guest tonight.
We get to bring you an extra special guest who, if you've been listening for the last several weeks, you've already heard about his family a little bit. So if we go back to episode 173, which was 6 or 7 episodes ago now, maybe a little bit more than that. I'm not counting. We talked about, actually, if you go to episode 172 and then follow it up with 173, we were talking about Calvary Cemetery. And in the first episode, we talked just about the cemetery itself, kind of gave everybody an overview. And in the second episode, I had said this was going to be a multiple part episode because there are a lot of really interesting stories buried in that cemetery. And this is the Calvary Cemetery in Dayton, Ohio, for anybody who hasn't listened. But in that second episode in 173, we talked about a man named Maurice Breen, who was an Irish immigrant who had come from Ireland and settled in Ohio and raised his family there. His brothers also came over from Ireland. And so we shared some of those stories. We talked about how he had been on the Underground Railroad. He was smuggling slaves up north to get them to freedom. And we didn't know as much as we knew now, but I did know in doing my research that there was a gentleman who had been tracking all of the family records, and a lot of what I was using for my research through ancestry.com came from the footwork that he had already done on his own family research. And I had said, if anybody knows Ed Breen and can send him our way, we would love to hear from him. And we were very fortunate that a bunch of people heard the episode and sent the episode to Ed, and he actually did reach out to us. And so we have him here tonight with us to tell us more about the Breen family stories. And there are so many great stories. And he's been kind enough to also supply us with a bunch of pictures, documents. And so we're going to try and pull those up as he's talking and telling the stories so that if you're watching us on YouTube, you can get a chance to see who he's talking about and some of the documentation. There's letters and other kinds of and newspaper articles, all kinds of fun stuff. So make sure that, again, if you're only listening on any of the audio formats, at some point you come check out the YouTube channel so that you'll get a chance to see all of these wonderful photographs and documentation that Ed has shared with us tonight. So Ed, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
And this is why it's so important to do family history and to know your family history and to share your family history, not only for, cemetery podcast people, but also for your kids to pass it down and their grandkids and great grandkids.
I sort of fell into it in the fact that my father lived this life that was kind of interesting, and he was in the paper literally all the time, and people would read about his desk mate, John Kennedy, in Congress, so they'd read about this. And so they knew about, and he dated the youngest woman ever crowned Miss America, and they come up to him and say, oh, ask these stories. And he was a very quiet man, and he never said to you these stories. And he would tell me privately, because when he was 50 years old, he married my mother 20 years. And when I was in high school, he was a 70-some-year-old man, and he'd go out to lunch every day because he's bored stiff. And I'd join him for lunch, and he'd tell me these stories. But when the public asked him about it, he was very mum, and he really felt uncomfortable telling people in life who he knew.
You're so lucky, because I remember asking my grandmother one time, so tell me what it was like growing up. Oh, no, that's water under the bridge. I mean, of course, when you start doing genealogy, you find out why there's water.
I'll say that about their grandparents. Like, my father never talked about World War II or something, they would say. My father was very open about World War II. And he would tell me he was on 4 invasion forces. And he would tell me these just odd, weird stories. And they weren't really about, some people, I went and blew this man up or something like that. Yeah. His stories were never like that. They were kind of funny. And he was talking about when they did the beach landings at Italy, everybody in his outfit, in the military of his time period, the only thing you knew about these people was their first name and their last name. Anything else about them is probably a lie. And my father said they didn't do it to be rude or to be a liar. It was more they were bored and it was entertainment. And my father always told everybody, they said, who are you and where you're from? He always said, I'm a goat farmer. I was born on a goat farm when he was actually born in a hotel. And he'd show pictures of his goats. And he would say, and then we'd be on a night patrol, and somebody would say, well, what's your mother do with dead goats and stuff? He's, oh, she makes purses out of them. We saw these at fairs and carnivals and things like that. Another man said he was a weasel farmer. And another man, Albert Stern from Champaign, Illinois, said, I just live at home with my mom, my brother Dick, and my sister Alice. And he showed this picture of his mom and his sister Alice. And some of these guys, halfway through the war, started saying, do you care, Albert, if I write to your sister? And he would say, no, go ahead, write to my sister. And they would write to this Alice, and she would write back. And towards the middle of the war, some of these guys were writing her torrid love letters, and she'd write these torrid love letters back, and she was sending cookies to them and knitted socks. And they would be out on night patrol, and somebody would say, hey, Albert, what do you think your sister's doing back in the States to? And he would say, oh, she's dating that boy that I hate, and he didn't get in the army because he has a bad heart. And so I can't wait for the war to come to end, and you can come home and marry my sister. And they would talk about Alice for hours, and she would send pictures of herself, and guys had it in their Jeeps. And the attitude of his troops was, I don't know you, you don't know me. And after this great big war, you're going home to your family and friends, and I'm going home to my family and friends. So what's it matter that I say to you in the middle? And so after the war, Albert goes into the construction business, and he builds these houses, and he names the street Ed Breen Drive. And he calls my father and says, you have to come to Champaign, Illinois. I'm dedicating this street to you. And my father said, I don't want to come to Champaign, Illinois. I don't want to meet the mayor of your town, and blah, blah, blah. And Albert wouldn't hear of it. So my father shows up in Champaign, Illinois, and they said, you're staying with my mother and my family at this apartment in Champaign. So the first night they're there, Mrs. Stern was like, this is Albert's bedroom. This is my son Dick's bedroom. This is the guest bedroom. This is my bedroom. And this is our living room. This is our dining room. And my father said, well, where's Alice stay? And she said, Alice who? And he goes, well, your daughter. And she goes, I don't have a daughter named Alice. Why would you think that? And he goes, well, Albert all through the war said he had a sister named Alice. And he said that little woman grabbed him by the neck and started shaking him and said, Albert, you son of a bitch. She said, why'd you lie to this nice man? And he said, well, they all lied to me. So I just lied back to him.
Well, then where were the cookies coming from?
They don't know. And he never said who this woman was. Never in his lifetime. So no one knows who this person was.
Oh my gosh.
And one man, they called him the horse. And the horse was from Syracuse, New York, I believe. He was a big Italian man. And I believe his first name was Anthony. And the horse rode in the front bow of these landing boats. And these boats were loaded the same way, all boats. And they started out 10 miles out to sea. They'd come on these big destroyers, climb over the side on rope ladders. And my father said it was extremely scary when the coxswain's mate would call out. They would circle in the bay of Salerno, for example, waiting for the boats to be loaded. Once they're loaded, they would call, we're inbound. And he said, when you heard a coxswain's mate call out, we're inbound, he said, the hair on your back stood on end. And he said, you'd look up into the sky and you'd see hundreds and hundreds of planes bringing in the 82nd Airborne to drop behind the German lines. And he said, you knew this is the real deal. And a guy who was on one of those boats said, we had this tradition that Anthony, the horse, was always in the bow of the boat. He was a low-grade officer, like a lieutenant or something. And he said, when you got within the mile zone and the mortar rounds started coming down and boats next to you were sinking, machine gun bullets were pinging off the side of the boat, my father called out, tap the horse. He said, when you heard a man call out, tap the horse, he said, literally your hair stood on end, because he said the two guys in the back of the dynamite would tap the two in front of them, would tap the two in front of them all the way up to the horse in the front. It was their tradition. It was their silent way of saying goodbye, good luck, I've got your back.
Oh.
And he said, you go up onto that beach and people were dying as soon as they came off that boat. That was their tradition, was they would say, tap the horse. And they said, when you heard tap the horse, we were within minutes of the front end coming down. And my father always had a Turriget cross. It's a Muslim cross that he was given by the Arabs. And he carried it under his shirt. He'd pull that cross out and kiss the cross for good luck. And an Arab man gave it to him because when they first landed in North Africa, troop trains were moving inland and the Arabs were riding alongside the troop trains on camelback and shooting into the troop trains. And they didn't want these people shooting into the troop trains. So they sent my father and 4 other men out into the desert and said, talk to these chieftains, get them to stop shooting into our troop trains. And when he went out there, they gave him this gift of this Red Cross, which he carried on his person whole time he was overseas during the war.
Wow. That's amazing. Obviously, it helped because he came home. He got to be one
Well,
of
he came
them.
home, but he had a sister that was over there, and she was in occupied France. She worked out of the American Embassy in Madrid. Her name was Maurice. And at one point, Maurice sent him a letter saying, I'll meet you in 2 weeks in Gibraltar. And Army censors read that letter, and they came to my father and said, who sent you this letter? And he said, my sister. And they said, we don't believe that your sister sent you this letter. And he said, well, she did. And they said, well, Gibraltar is a British fort. Gibraltar, no woman can get on Gibraltar. And that would be Maurice there. And he said 2 weeks later, I meet Maurice on Gibraltar. She was there, and she worked out Eisenhower's headquarters. And Maurice wrote in her diary, she said, we were sitting on the back balcony of my hotel, and he was smoking a cigarette. And she said, I saw a German plane get caught in the spotlights. And so I turned to my little brother and said, doesn't that bother you that this man's going to get shot out of the air and be killed in a couple minutes? And my father turned to her and said, doesn't bother me in the least. I could care less. He said, I saw this in North Africa. I saw it in Sicily. She wrote in her diary, my, how the war has changed. And the next morning, she was on the tarmac waving goodbye to him. And she said, this is the same child that I used to watch play marbles. And she said, now I'm sending him back to Anzio, bloody Anzio. I wish I could send him home to mother.
Oh, wow. Well, and she put herself in an awful lot of danger doing what she did too. So, I mean, he might have been going to the front lines, but
when she was flying over there for the assignment, a sergeant sitting across from her pulled out a 45 and said, lady, you better keep this on you because the last lady that did your job got strung up by piano wire. And she said, that was kind of scary to hear a man say that.
I bet. And yet she went on and did it anyway.
Yeah, she did. And Maurice was a force to be reckoned with. I don't know anybody in their lifetime that ever stood up to her. And, everybody was scared of her. I think President Roosevelt was afraid of her. I think most senators were afraid of her. She knew Roosevelt as a child, because Roosevelt was running against Cox for president of the United States. He's running as vice president. And he got to know Maurice as a 16-year-old. And he eventually wrote a letter, and it was sent to the American Embassy asking her to come and work at the White House. And he said, don't tell Eleanor, but have her come work at the White House. And she said, I wouldn't go work for that man if you paid me. And she was an ardent Republican, and she didn't like Roosevelt in the least. And she thought the world of Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, and my father couldn't stand her. So it's tit for tat, I suppose, kind of thing. But they were originally in the hotel business, to go back to the roots. And my father was born in the Phillips House Hotel, where his father was the manager. And they went through the Dayton flood, and they were in the Phillips House Hotel during the flood. And the Phillips House was torn down in 1926. And at that point, John Breen retired from the hotel business. And he didn't want to go into the hotel. He'd been voted 40 years straight best hotel man in the state of Ohio by the Ohio Hotel Men's Association. But one of the weirder stories that my father would tell about the Phillips House, he said there was a man about 450 pounds, and he was a bicycle salesman. He'd come to town every fall, and he'd get on a bike and ride it around in front of the Phillips House. And he would say, if a guy as fat as me can ride this bike and hold my weight, it can certainly hold your weight. And he would take orders for his bikes. And on his last day there, he stuck his head out of his hotel room, was yelling for my grandmother, and she came to the room. He said, somebody stole my clothes last night. I don't have any clothes. He said, I have nothing.
Oh,
and
no.
She said, well, let me go to a store in town and see if I can't get some pants and clothes for you. And she went to a bunch of stores, and they said, no, we don't make clothes in that size. So she took two of her skirts, cut them in half, and then sewed them back together. And my father said, the last we saw this man, he was pushing his bike down the street wearing two of mother's skirts sewed together. And he was barefoot, and he was towards the train station.
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness. And just for clarification for our listeners, so again, if you listen to episode 173, we talked about Maurice Breen. John is one of Maurice's sons. Is that correct?
Yes, he is, correct.
Yes.
He is his son. And after the Phillips house closed down, they opened 4 years later a hotel here in Dayton called the Dayton Biltmore. And it was the fanciest hotel opened outside of Mississippi, Chicago, New York. And they always bragged it was fireproof because it was a brick building. And the Biltmore was so fancy that it opened a week after the stock market crash. And they were so scared. The opening up this very, very expensive hotel with potted palms in the lobby, $1 million oil paintings on the wall. And the stock market had crashed, the great stock market crash a month before. And they had a man named, I think his name was Colonel Walker, and he was managing the hotel. And they were going deeper and deeper into bankruptcy. So they called John Breen up and said, would you take over management of this hotel? We're scared we're going to go belly up. And John said, I will take over the hotel under one condition, and that is that you allow my son to be co-manager with me. They said, yes, we'll agree to that. So my father called my father, his father called my father down in Cincinnati, and he worked at Gibson Hotel, and he was down three levels below the sidewalk doing cutting potatoes. And his father said, come back to Dayton. I've got a job for you. You can be assistant manager here with me. And within a month, John hired a man by the name of Henry Parks to be bartender. Henry Parks was the best bartender in the city of Dayton, bar none. If they didn't take Henry, some other hotel would. And I have a feeling, I don't know this for sure, Henry Parks may have worked at the Phillips house, or John may have worked. And about a month after Henry was hired to be the bartender, 4 waiters came up to my grandfather's office and said, we can't work with Henry down there. We're not getting tips. Nobody wants to be served a drink by a black man. And John Breen said, is that so? And they said, yes, that's so. And they said, if you don't get rid of him, we're going to quit. And John said, well, send Henry up to my office and I'll take care of business. Solve your problem. So Henry comes up to John Breen's office, and John called my father in and said, sit here and listen to how I deal with this situation. And he said, Henry, how many drinks a minute can you make? Henry said, as many as you want, Mr. Breen. He said, how many different varieties of drinks can you make? He said, as many as you want, Mr. Breen. He said, are you aware of the fact that 4 men just came up here and told me that you're driving away business down there, and they don't want to work with you down there? And Henry said, yes, I'm aware of that. He said, that makes me so damn mad. He said, I'm promoting you to head of the dining room, giving you a sizable pay raise. He said, please go down there and find those 4 men and tell them that we no longer need them here at the hotel. And they can come back on Friday and pick up their paycheck. And within a week, they started getting hate mail from the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan said they were going to pick at the hotel, and it grew into a major incident. And my grandfather suspected that the hotel was in bankruptcy and was owned by a bank, and he suspected one of the bankers was a Klansman and stirring up this trouble. And so they called my father and his father across the street, had a special meeting, and they said, look, the Klan's going to pick at this hotel. You need to change your mind and get rid of Henry. And my grandfather said, you came to me 6 months ago, asked me to take over this hotel. I've taken over the hotel and I'm turning a profit. He said, don't you come over and tell me how to run my hotel. I won't come over here and tell you how to run your bank. And if you want to tell me how to run my hotel, I'll quit on you. And so they left him alone, and Henry stayed on as for many years after that.
Wow.
Wow, definitely. Wow.
That's how John Breen was. He was a very powerful man, and he didn't talk that way to him or any of the Breen family, because he would end up on the wrong side.
Well, he knew what was right, and
And
he
he stood
wasn't
up for
going to back
principles.
down.
Well,
Yeah,
the minority
exactly.
people that worked for the hotel, they worked for him for years, and they were family to him. And I suspect Henry Parks was of that league. He was probably considered family to my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like
And
it.
so you wouldn't come up there and say, I'm going to quit on him. you need to fire this guy because you're going to get fired.
When you don't
And-
fire your best employees because 4 other employees
Right,
decided they didn't
exactly.
like him.
Exactly right. And John retired 2 years later, and my father took over the hotel. And he managed it with another man by the name of John Beers, B-E-R-S. And they had to pick the silverware, the hotel. And they said, well, we put Dayton Biltmore on the silverware. And John Beers said, no, my last name starts with B, yours starts with B. Let's just put a B on the knives, forks, and spoons. And then if the hotel ever goes out of business, we've got our own monogram silverware.
It's the way to do it.
And in that time period, my father was under a very strict contract. He had to wear white gloves to open the car door. He had to have his hair co-piered every morning. They had to put your shoes outside the room every night, and they would polish your shoes. And Alice Roosevelt was the oldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt. She was kind of a wild child, and she was married to Nicholas Longworth out of Cincinnati. She'd come home, find him drunk, passed out on the floor, or whatever. So she'd get mad and she'd get her chauffeur from they'd come down to Biltmore. My father said that damn woman would come in about 9 o'clock at night, yelling and carrying on. And he said, I always wanted the hotel to go quiet because people wanted to get to sleep. There were salesmen and stuff. And she'd walk down the hallway, mix up everybody's shoes and tie them together, and he would get furious. And he said, this is a 50-year-old woman, and she's acting like that. And he would just get absolutely livid. And I said that to Mayor Wees one time. Mayor Wees said, Alice was a good friend of mine. I knew her from embassies overseas. She was a hoot. And he said, your dad just needs to get a sense of humor. And I went home, said, your sister said you need to get a sense of humor. He said, what's so funny about tying up somebody's shoes and inconveniencing somebody in the morning? He said, I don't see that.
Oh
And
my
he'd get
goodness.
upset about that. And there were a lot of just odd things that happened at the hotel. Man one time came with his wife on Halloween night, and they were going to have dinner, and they did. And then they went off to the room, and my father said about 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a phone call that they needed an emergency doctor up in the room. And my father went up to inquire as to why they needed a doctor in their room. And they said the woman had fallen asleep, and the man had fallen asleep. The man fell asleep and walked out in the hallway, completely nude, took all her clothes off. She put on a Halloween mask. She knocks on the door, completely nude, wearing a Halloween mask. And he's half asleep, and he opens the door. And she said, trick or treat. And he was so shocked, he fell backwards and hit the door frame.
Oh no.
And cut his head open.
Oh no.
That's not bad. I mean, that's sad. He cut his head open.
Yeah, but he thought his wife, I guess, was still asleep next to him or something. He goes and opens the door and sees this nude woman, and she's wearing a Halloween
In a mask.
Yeah, she's wearing a mask, and said trick or treat. And he was just so shocked he fell backwards.
Oh my gosh.
And then there was one time the Shriners had a convention there, and they were up on the rooftop balcony, and they filled a bag of water, and there were people watching the parade down below, and they dropped this bag of water off the 16th floor, and they thought it was going to come down and hit this man on the head and just soak him. Came down like a ton of bricks and hit this man and killed him. And my father had to call the man's wife and say, I'm sorry that our husband was killed by somebody at our hotel having a party.
Oh no.
And so they had an incident like that. And then people of all walks of life stay there. Orville Wright stayed at the hotel sometimes. And my father had known Orville since he was a 5-year-old child. And he had always been friends with Orville for years. And eventually they became a congressman, worked with Orville Wright because Orville wanted the Air Force Academy brought to Dayton, Ohio. And my father was going to pass a bill in Congress to help Orville. Orville died the year before. And Air Force Academy was beaten out because they said all the service academies are out east. They're in New York and Maryland. And so it went out to Colorado Springs. My father said he was glad that Orville was deceased by that point because I didn't want to have to go to Orville and say I didn't get my bill passed because he was so depending on hopefully the Air Force Academy would be brought to Dayton. And my father said the generals aren't listening to me, so he enlisted former Governor Cox and said, Jim Cox, take Eddie out to right field and get him to talk to these generals and get this Air Force coming here. And I think Jim Cox took my father out there and they had lunch with a few generals, but the generals just didn't. And one of my father's favorite friends at that time period was, first off, a woman came to town by the name of Marion Bergeron. She was crowned Miss America at age, and she was now.
I'm sorry, what age was that? It cut out on
15.
us. 15.
1933. She became the youngest Miss America ever. And she started dating my father. She started singing at the Biltmore Hotel with the Guy Lombardo Band. And she eventually married my father's best friend. And all three of them went on the honeymoon together. My father went on honeymoon with them, went to a Miss America show in New Jersey, the honeymoon. But one of my father's best friends in that time period was Paul Mance. Paul Mance, Hollywood stunt pilot, except that Paul would never refer to himself as a stunt pilot. He said I was a precision flying. He mathematically figured out where to get that plane between a tree or a barn. He was the only pilot in America licensed to fly a plane with, that's the picture there. And
Is that it? Okay.
yes, that's the picture. He was the only pilot in America licensed to fly a plane under a bridge, building, or between trees. And Paul built the interior of Amelia Earhart's airplane. And my father said the way Paul talked to me in Dayton at the Biltmore was, he said, I got the impression he was tired of a fraternity brother with Amelia Earhart and her husband. And one day Paul said, you want to fly to California with me and have dinner with Amelia Earhart, George Putnam. And so my father said, sure, I'll fly to California. Well, they go out to the field here, and his mother comes out, and his mother standing next to my father, and they said this big truck came up and was putting hundreds of gallons of fuel in this plane. And she turns to my father and said, Mr. Mance is so nice to fly you to California. Why don't you offer to pay for gas? And my father said, I wasn't about to pay for gas. They were putting so much, hundreds of gallons of fuel in that plane. And they took off. And I asked somebody at right field later on, I said, what kind of airplane is that? He said, it's a Northrop A-17, most advanced fighter plane, 1937. And I think Paul was testing the plane or something. Got over the Grand Canyon, and Paul said to radioed my father in the back of the plane and said, do you want to see the Grand Canyon? And my father said, I've never seen it before. And he said, I thought he was going to tip the wings and let me look over the side. He nosed out of that plane straight into the Grand Canyon, shot it up another wall, and then flew upside down through the Grand Canyon. My father said, it scared the living daylights out of me. And right field said, historians out there said, if you're saying Paul Mance did that, yes, he probably did that. And Northrop A-17 was capable of doing something. And they get out to the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. Amelia and her husband, George Putnam, show up at the table. And my father said, I'm sitting at the other end of the table with Terry Miner, who had been an ex-girlfriend of my father's. She was married to a pilot, and I think his name was Roy Miner, possibly. And he died of cancer, died early in life. She came to Dayton, wanted to marry my father, and he didn't want to bachelor. And somehow she met Paul Mance. And they were going to announce the engagement of Terry Miner. And George Putnam was a kind of a crude little man, and he and Paul were getting into it at the other end of the table. Paul said, I want a radio. And on that plane, she finally takes off. And father said, I'm sitting at the far end of the table with Terry Miner and Earhart. He said, they weren't tighter than a fraternity brother. He said, they kind of treated Paul like he was an employee of the company. And my father said, I think Paul was a little embarrassed, and they were treating him like, Mr. Mance, Paul, how are you? You know, and this and that. And my father said, the picture itself is not rare. That picture was taken at, I believe, the 1934 Bendix races. And the picture has been reproduced hundreds of times. But what is really rare about that photo are the signatures on it. And Amelia Earhart, because she died young, didn't sign a lot of photos. So events are there, but Amelia would never have signed, people say, a photo with Terry Miner's signature. She just wouldn't do it because she didn't like Terry Miner. And what happened was Amelia signed the photo, and she and George Putnam left before dessert. And then they left Paul and Terry at the table with my father, and that's when Paul and Terry signed the photo.
So it happened after her signature was already on there.
Right. And then she died, I think a year later or something.
I was going to say it would have been not too long afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was kind of mad at Paul Mans towards the end. And he didn't want her to fly with Fred Noonan. Fred was an alcoholic at that point. He'd been the best navigator for Pan Am, but those days were long in the past. I don't think they wanted that. And so my father loved the hotel business. He stayed in the hotel business the rest of his life. His sister wrote him a letter and said, get out of the National Guard. She said, the man Hitler is going to set the world on fire. And she was based at that point out of the American Embassy in Berlin. She was parading as an American journalist, and she was a Sunday correspondent for the Dayton Daily News, but she was actually a colonel in Army intelligence. And she wrote him and said, get out. So he wrote to the War Department, said, I'd like to be relieved of command. And they said, that's not possible because you're in the rank of captain, and we're not going to release you from command. And
is that appropriate picture that I just put up?
Not yet, but it's going to get to be appropriate. There is the Trig cross that
Yes.
It represents the four corners of the world. And an Arab man will give that to a small child saying, I can't be with you everywhere in the world, but if you have this cross with you, God and I will be with you in four corners. If you can read that Trig cross, it tells you where those people market. So if they found your body in the desert, they know where your family market is.
Wow.
But when Pearl Harbor hit, my father had to resign from the hotel business. He was immediately sent to Texas. He was sent to El Paso, Texas, thinking that Mexico may invade the United States. And once they got down there, they were waiting to see what Mexico would do. And they started dating some of the local girls. And after the first date, my father said to two of his friends, that woman I went out with had a wooden arm. They're like, oh, that's BS. And he said, no, I seriously had a wooden arm. And one man said, I'll bet you $20. And he said, okay, I'll take your bet. Then the other man said, I'll bet you $20 she didn't have a wooden arm. And he also took the bet. They went out with these two girls, and about halfway through the date, one guy said, Ed, I guess I owe you $20. It was about $20. And the other guy said, Ed, I think I owe you $20 too. Pays him $20. And immediately, soon after that, they get sent to Wisconsin, and they're on heavy machine gun training. Then they're put on trains. Windows are painted over on the trains. You couldn't look out the train, and 4 of our Army engineers run by the train tracks. Even if you took a nickel, scratched off that window, you could not see, because they had taken the signs along the side of the track, changed the signs. So the sign might say, welcome to the Third National Bank of Kansas City. You might be in Toledo, Ohio. And they did that to defuse spies. And they were given heavy Arctic warfare equipment, and Army intelligence was mixed in with his troops. They said, you're being sent up to the Russian front, and you're going to be fighting the Germans on the Russian front. Mm-hmm. And then they were sent to Fort Dix, New Jersey. They had no idea where they were being sent. And they were then put on troop ships, and they were so far below deck, he said, I could hear the German subs below our ship. I could hear the depth charges being dropped to do that. And about the 5th day out, they said, come up on deck. And he said, you came up on deck, you saw ships, hundreds of them in every direction. He said, your heart starts, because there was so much ships in so many directions. And General Patton was on the lead ship. He gave a speech, said, we've been zigzagging off the coast of Africa, and we've been going to North Africa, South Africa, and now we're going to make a landing tomorrow. It's going to be a 3-pronged invasion, and fighting is going to be intense. Some of you are going to get killed, and some of you are going to lose your lives. But he said, I expect you all to do your jobs. I expect you to be a soldier of the American Armed Forces. And after Patton gave his speech, an officer stood up and said, anybody have any questions about the general's speech? Man's hand shot up. He said, yes, I have a question. And he said, what is it, Ferguson? He said, the general said the fighting's going to be intense. He said, I just want to know what kind of tent, pup tents, wall tents, dome tents. And they said, shut up, Ferguson. Nobody needs to hear that stuff.
Sounds like a response.
Yeah.
that you
And
would
so
get from-
the next day they had this three-pronged invasion, and my father landed near Casablanca, and they came ashore, and he enjoyed his time in North Africa, but he learned to dislike camels very much. And he said, I didn't like camels. They spit on you and they bit you. Said, we're not nice animals. They love the Arab people, love the Arab traditions. And eventually then they moved on to Sicily, and they were on the invasion of Sicily. And there again, they were, tap the horse kind of thing where they landed. And Italy was, he said, I could have rotated back to the States. He said, what was really weird was when he got to Sicily, the officers he had been with in Texas, he said, that Christmas, I got a Christmas box and nobody else got a present because the troops were moving so fast. He said, everybody gathered around to see why I got a Christmas present. Nobody else did. And he said, I opened up this box. There's a wooden arm in there from a mannequin, store mannequin, and said, Eddie, I wish you'd come back to Texas. I really miss you. And there were some wilted flowers with it. That was from the officers that had served him in Texas.
Uh-huh.
And so everybody couldn't understand when my father burst out laughing, and because they weren't in Texas with him and didn't know that. But after the landings in Italy, they were told to take the port city of Naples. And my father was the lead officer going into Naples. And I often said to him, why were you the lead officer going into Naples, Italy? Why wouldn't a colonel or a general or somebody else be the lead officer? He said, well, I'm not going to defame anybody. But he said, we knew down in southern Italy that there was beriberi in that city. There was dysentery. There was cholera. And anybody that could ask off of it begged off that assignment. He said, if I could have found my sister Maurice, I would have gotten her to take me off that assignment. 10-year-old sniper kids up on the rooftop. Some of the buildings were booby trapped. And he said, I couldn't get out of it. My senior officers said I was ordered there. So he said, I went there. And they were coming up Malcolm Drive, the shore road. And my father said the real heroes, Corps of Army Engineers, were building bridges overnight. The Germans had blown up. They were building these bridges to support his tanks. He had about 17 tanks, 22 trucks of infantry. And he was in a Jeep. It's like 7 or 8 military police escort in front of him with sirens going and military police behind him. And he said he ordered all his tank drivers and truck drivers, said, don't eat anything that these Italians are offering you. If you don't know if it's poisoned, don't take anything that anybody offers you. And he said, I don't stop American tank column. He said, Naples, we're going to go to the city of Naples. He said, we got to the top, Malfia Drive. There were two, he said, I perceived bums. He said, there were men in raggedy clothes and they were signaling me. He said, something in my mind said, I need to stop. And so he said, I stopped my Jeep, sent an aide over and said, find out what these two men want. And they came over and the man said, I'm Baron Riccardi. This is former King Victor Emmanuel of Italy. And our families are starving to death. And if you would promise us 2 truckloads of food, we'll get you into Naples. And my father said, you can have your 2 truckloads of food in Naples. And they had this old beat up limo. My father said it was so comical to see this old beat up limo tank column into the city of Naples. He spent about 6 months to 9 months in Naples, Italy. He actually enjoyed the time there. And one of the bizarre stories that came out there was an army nurse walked up to him and said, see that child over there? He's 10 years old. His parents were killed last night in bombing. The Germans were bombing the Naples harbor almost every night. And he said, would you adopt that boy and let him live in a castle that you took on the hillside? And I said, sure, he can live with us. And so they threw this kid in the back of the Jeep. They said, we couldn't pronounce his last name because it was so long Italian name. So we just started calling this kid Willie. And he said, Willie would make breakfast for you in the morning, give him a little money. He started wearing bits and pieces of our uniform, give him our old combat boots, and our old pants. He'd walk into your room at night, and he said, most of my men were hardened combat soldiers, Omaha, Kansas, all over the country. And he'd start speaking Italian, telling you stuff in Italian. And my men just started saying, "Oh, piss on you, what the hell?" And he would come in and start making breakfast for you, and serve breakfast for you, and they'd be eating the breakfast, and they would turn around and say, "Oh, Willie, piss on you, get out of here. I can't stand it." And about a month later, my father was walking down the street, and he said, this big, heavy-set Army nurse crosses the street, walks up to him and said, "Major, can I ask you a question about Willie?" My father said, "Sure, what do you want to know?" She's like, "Well, he's a friend of mine, and he came to me last night, said, you and your men keep saying Oda Pisania to him. He doesn't know what that means. You explain that to me so I can go back and tell him what it is you're saying to him." And my father said, my mouth fell open. And he said, the more I looked at this woman, the meaner she looked. And he said, I was dumbfounded. And she said, "What's Pisania?" And she said, "Is it something you want to eat for breakfast?" And he said, "Yeah, it's a French loaf of bread for men like you." And she said, "Well, I never heard of a French loaf of bread called Pisania." And he said, "Tell you what, I'll get you a loaf sometime to see how you like it." Because they were saying, "Oh, piss on you." And he went to this lady and said, "Oh, they just keep saying Oda Pisania." And she was trying to be helpful.
Oh, no.
And help him out. And my father said, I just avoided that woman the rest of the war.
Yeah, I can see where he'd probably not want to have that conversation a
and
second
then-
time.
That's a picture of him in Naples, and he's leaning against this is a picture of him leaning against air raids. They got air raids almost every night.
Right.
And when they first came to Naples, he took over the main post office in the city, and he didn't realize it, but he took over the 8th-story post office, and Time Life magazine had followed the troops in, and they had gotten in the building next door and had their camera set up, and they drew straws, and he got a short straw with 3 other men, and they went to the rolling canteens down the road, coming back, and then dynamite went off in his office, and the entire building collapsed, and over 100 people died that day.
Oh,
Building. And he came back from the war. He said, I was just so messed up from the war and just this and that. And somebody said, well, you need to run for Congress. And he said, I'm not doing that. He said, I never liked politicians. Went to Mr. Hilton, back in the hotel business. And Mr. Hilton said, I don't have a hotel in Dayton for you, but take over the one in New York City, or you can take over the one in Los Angeles, places. And my father said, well, I want to stay in Dayton. And mother, he said, when you're in the Army and you tell you to turn right, what do you do? He said, right, but I'm not in the Army. Mr. Hilton said, well, you're in my Army now. And he said, when he said that, it just burped him off. And he came home and ran for mayor of Dayton. He won by such a landslide. And he was the youngest mayor of Dayton at that time. And he said, I was trying to be progressive. And I was trying to radio was kind of new. And so he said, I decided to radio broadcast city council meetings. He said, they're all old kind of guys on there from previous administrations. And he said, when you have something to say to me, cover the microphone. Because just going out to all these wives at home, doing their ironing and stuff. And he said they had that radio going for about a week. Commissioner turned to him and said, Mayor, I've got to go take a piss. Well, that went all over the city of Dayton. Women called in and said, my children were there in the house. They all heard that. And people complained. So my father said, again, cover the microphone. You got something to say. And about a week later, they were talking about a filter system, a swimming pool. And this man said, we used to jump in the Erie Canal. We'd come up with horse shit on our head. And we're still alive today. And my father said, at that, we just pulled the plug because he said, we got so much slack. People, I just couldn't control these people. And the picture behind you was my father was the mayor of Dayton at the time. The picture, and Truman asked him come to Cincinnati and give him hell special and ride through Southern Ohio with him. And Truman said, I'll promote your campaign. And they stayed at the Netherlands Hotel. My father said the next morning, I come down and a campaign aide said, go in that room over there and you can get a donut and some coffee. And he said, I went in that room. There was an old man sitting there reading the newspaper. And he said, I couldn't see the man could get his face. And he said, I was excited about writing him to give him how special with the truth of President Truman. So he said, I got my coffee and donut and I sat next to this old man. And I said, I hear the old man's gonna be on the train with us today. He said, Truman put down the newspaper and said, yes, I'll be on the train. And my father said he was humiliated and really embarrassed and introduced himself. And so the first stop was Cincinnati. And when they got on the train, Truman came out on the back platform, said, 80th Congress was the worst Congress in the history of the United States. Get rid of the 80th Congress. Put in bright young men like Eddie Breen here. Eddie Green's a friend of mine, and Eddie and I can work together. And if you put in Eddie Breen, we could have a good Congress. And they get to Hamilton, Ohio, and Truman has my father come out on the back platform, and he puts his arm around my father and said, 80th Congress, the worst Congress in the history of the United States. Get rid of these do-nothing congressmen. Put in Eddie Breen. Eddie Breen can do a lot of good things for this place. Next stop, he says the same thing in Middletown, Ohio. And a reporter walked up to my father and said, is he referring to you as Breen or Green? My father said, I think he's referring to me as Eddie Breen. He said, well, the next stop's Dayton, Ohio. And he puts his arm around you and calls you my good friend and calls you Eddie Green. You're going to be the laughing stock of Dayton, Ohio. He said, you need to correct the president and tell him the last name. So my father told one of the president's aides that his name was Breen, not Green. So he corrected it by the time they got to Dayton.
I love it.
For the rest of his life, people would walk up to my father and say, my good friend Eddie Green. And, in the picture there, my father's riding in the front seat, two Secret Service agents, and he was supposed to have ridden in the back seat between Governor Cox and President Truman, but somebody had called him in the hotel the night before and said, if you go down the street with Truman tomorrow, I'm going to shoot you. And he had to call the Secret Service and say they had received a death threat. So they put him in the front seat, guard you in the front seat. And that's why he was in the front seat. Nothing happened. They went down the street. Then they went to Memorial Hall and they had a nice day of it. And that eventually is a picture of my father with his three secretaries when he was elected to Congress. And John Kennedy was second term in Congress in that Congress. And my father and Jack Kennedy went to Irish Catholic boys in Congress. And the interesting thing was they became almost inseparable, and they became desk mates where they sat next to each other because they're both Democrats and they were the Irish Catholic boys in Congress. But my father was introduced to John Kennedy by the Meade family in Ohio. And the Meades owned Meade Paper Company. They owned a home, summer home in Hyannis. And their son, George Meade Jr., was supposed to have become a congressman with Joe Kennedy Jr. after the war. And Joe Kennedy Jr. was killed when his plane blew up over the English Channel. And George Meade died at the Battle of Tarawa. He had been John Kennedy's roommate at Choate Academy in Wallingford, Connecticut. They had been either roommates or down the hall from each other. And after George Meade Jr. died at the Battle of Tarawa, John Kennedy went to Tarawa and broke down crying in George's grave. And it's the only time I think someone said they saw John Kennedy cry in public. And Mr. Meade, when my father got elected, Meades were kind of bitter. Their son had died during the war. And Mr. Meade said, I'll come to Washington. We know this family from Massachusetts, Kennedy, will introduce you. So Mr. Meade came to Washington and introduced them. And many people told me that they actually lived together in an apartment. I don't believe it. Personally, never believed it. And I don't know that my father ever told me he did with John Kennedy. But there was people, like 10 people in this town, one of them being the son of Mrs. Marion Bergeron. He said, no, my mother actually told me stories about going to that apartment with her Miss America friends. And Jack Kennedy and my father would double date and hang out at the bar at the shore. And that's probably true. I believe they double dated. Sure, but I'm not lived together by any means. Maybe they did. If you go down a little farther on that Christmas card, you can see what's sign.
Yeah, I was trying to see if I could show you the signature.
Show you the signature. He has 3 or 4 of those cards. That's just one of them. Every year, he got a card from Jack Kennedy, and I've kept all the cards. My father was never very good about anything. He threw everything in a big green trunk he had, and the trunk's marked property U.S. House of Representatives. And he would always say, oh, I have a picture of Amelia Earhart. I have a letter from Orville Wright. I have this. Let's go look through this trunk someday.
I know.
Said, well, I can't look through it right now. I have to clean it up. And eventually he died. That's when we finally were able to open it up and pull this stuff out. And I put it between plastic and tried to preserve it.
Well, I'm glad that you have taken the time to try and preserve so much, because
Oh my gosh.
you found the letters, you found all these photos. And you had mentioned in one of your emails to me a book that had been written.
Yeah, Lucky Eddie.
Yes, thank you. I was like trying to remember. I knew Eddie
No,
was
we
in the
wrote a
name.
book called Lucky Eddie. And then there's some people, a number of people that would like to preserve all this history, like to make a film out of it. But I have a producer, I have a director, kind of, they're not going anywhere fast with it. And sued a lot of media and tried to get financing. And financing has not come about. Looked at all the media in the Dayton area and not got much help. But if anybody out there is watching this broadcast and they've got that kind of money and want to finance a film, I'd be glad to listen to you at least for the next 6 months. After that, I'm going to be 67 years old and I'm ready to hang it all up. I mean, I've done what I'm going to do, and I'm going to cancel the film project at that point. I go as far as I can, but if somebody really wanted to film in it, us do it in my direction and film out of his home in Maine. His home in Maine was spectacular, and it's a national park, and they want to do the film the way I think you would, and you probably have a good return on the dollar. They do real well with it. That was, I don't have to see it.
Well, his story is definitely the American story.
For sure.
Yeah, no, it's American Dream for sure.
American Dream,
And
yeah.
you add in Maurice, and you add in the sister Maurice.
Yeah.
Maurice was a kind lady, sweet lady, but no doctor, nurse at her nursing home ever stood up to her. And when I first married my wife, we were in Maine, and this is the way it was in the family. I said to my wife, we were going over to Maurice's, her husband's name is Bob Garrity, and we were going over to their home for dinner that night. I said to my wife, we're going to have to go to church tomorrow because Harbor, Maurice's going to see that we go to church tomorrow. My wife turns to me and said, I'm not going to church tomorrow. I'm tired. I'm sleeping. I'm going to tell your aunt that I'm not Catholic and I don't intend to go to church anymore. And she said, I don't know why everybody in this family is so scared of that woman. He said, I went out to lunch with her yesterday. She's the sweetest, nicest, kindest lady. And she's not going to have a problem with me telling her that I'm not Catholic, that I'm going to sleep in tomorrow. And I said, fine, you tell her that. And so we were sitting there at dinner table, and Mayor Lee said, church tomorrow is at 9:30 Northeast Harbor or 10 o'clock in Bar Harbor. Which one do you intend to go to? And I sat there waiting for my wife to say something, and she goes, I think we'll go to 10 o'clock in Bar Harbor. And Mayor Weiss said, oh, well, we're going to be at that one too. We can all go to lunch afterwards. And so then get in the car and we're driving home. And I said, my wife, I said, I thought you were going to tell her you weren't Catholic and you were going to sleep in tomorrow and everything. And she said, well, you heard how she put it. There was no room to negotiate.
And
I'll have
this
to
is
remember
how
that,
she
Jennie.
conducted business during the war. I'm sure of it.
Mayor Weiss, even as a small child, was, I think even her father was afraid of her. She said, my father thought that women that smoked cigarettes were the lowest form of life that there could be. Couldn't stand women that smoked cigarettes. And he said, she said, I saw him one day looking out the dining room window of the Phillips house, and I was standing across the street at the courthouse. She said, I was 15 years old. I lit up a cigarette and smoked it. And he continued to look at me, so I lit up a second cigarette and smoked it. And I said, well, what'd your father say? And she said, nothing. He never said a word to me. And another story that Mary Weiss told me, which tells you her personality, she said when she went to elementary school, she said a very wealthy lady, Mrs. Barney, come by with her chauffeur, pick her up, and drive her home with her girlfriend. And she went to her mother and said, Mrs. Barney picks us up after school every day with her chauffeur and makes us drive home with her, and we want to walk home. We don't want to go home with Mrs. Barney and her chauffeur. And her mother said, well, Mrs. Barney is a very nice lady. She's a dear friend of mine, and you girls just behave yourself. Get in her car and you let her drive you home. And Mary Weiss said, I got no help from my mother. So she said, I brought a bag of peanuts to school the next day. And me and my girlfriend and I, she said, we ate a bag of peanuts. Then we wiped our nice greasy hands all over her leather car seats. And we did that 2 days in a row, and she stopped picking us up.
They solved their own problem.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of person There always
Oh.
was.
I love it. Well, Ed, thank you so much
This
for
is so
taking time
great.
out of your evening tonight to tell us more about your
Oh,
family.
you're welcome. Thank you.
It's been so much fun to listen to all these stories. And this is why we do this podcast, so that these stories get out there so people know them. Hopefully somebody was listening that wants to take on the film project. I know they're expensive and tricky to do, but it
Well, I hope so. I
definitely
don't
would
want
be
any
worth
phone
it.
calls from people who call me up and say, hey, have you called this person? You called that person? Believe me, after 5 years, we've called this person, that person. We call everybody. And if you don't have the money, don't call me. I mean,
Well,
I hate to be rude about it, but it's
But-
just, you've gotten to a point where it's either, you follow me to Maine and see this man's house and see how this man was living. And when you see how this man was living, he was basically an aristocrat, but he was all about the poor people. And that's
Mhm.
why they never forgot their Irish roots. And that's why people always voted him into Congress, because they said he was there for the little guy. And when a mother would call my father in tears when I was in high school, say, my son couldn't get into Notre Dame, you want to go there to college? I said, what's your son's name? He'd take old stationery he had when he was a congressman. He'd write some fluff letter saying, I've known this child all my life and why you denied him and thing. And then he'd prompt the mother. He said, no, they're going to call you up because they got a letter from a former congressman and they're going to say this and that. And he said, no, you answer this way. And if they call me, I'm going to tell them the same thing and blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, that child would get into Notre Dame. And he wasn't afraid to write a letter and yes somebody. And he'd turn around and say to me, well, you got to toss a lot of Irish bologna in life. And he said, everybody tosses that Irish bologna. And he said, I didn't get much when I left Congress, but a handshake. So he said, this is my way of getting back at him.
I love it so much.
Yeah.
I do.
And just one last thing. The man absolutely was Irish to the core. Black cat crossed the street in front of him. He spit twice between his fingers, turned the car around and drove down another street. It used to irritate daylights out of me.
I bet he did. But
Yeah,
he did a lot of good. So
He did a lot of good, but he was never afraid to take a phone call at 11, 12 o'clock at night. And if you called him at 11, 12 o'clock at night and said, did I get you out of bed? He was so well trained, he would never say to you, got me out of bed at 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, no, I'm up reading a book. I'm watching TV. What is he going to eat?
Wow. What a man.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's probably why he had 1,000 people come to his funeral, all walks of life. And my wife said, it's mostly going to be congressmen and senators coming to his funeral. I said, no, it's going to be people that are janitors, maids, and lower class
People he actually helped.
People
Right.
that loved him, and he loved them.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Ed. Thank you for listening to your friends who were saying contact us and then actually contacting us. We've had
Yeah, it
so much
actually
fun
worked.
sharing.
You broadcast that out there, and I had at least 5 people contact me. And I don't follow podcasts. I'm not technically literate, and my wife had to set this all up for me. And there was a lady at work, Brandy Reedy, and she's a secretary for my boss. And Brandy actually said, you know what? There's some people looking for me. And I said, well, who's looking for me? And she said, these ladies out in Colorado. And she then sent this to me. So thank you, Brandy. I appreciate it. You
Thank
got me
you.
on the show tonight.
Thanks,
Brandy's a
Brandy.
wonderful person. And oh yeah, she's a nice lady, and she's the best that we have as far as a secretary. I wouldn't ask for anybody better.
Oh, well, Brandy, thanks for listening.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
for
you.
sending it our way. These are the stories we want to be able to share. So, and it's always better when we have the descendants to share them as opposed to me or Dianne just doing the research and putting it. I mean, we don't do a horrible job or anything, but it's just better coming from you guys
Well,
than it is
We
from us.
wouldn't have these stories.
Well, I can't
We
wait
would
to go to
not
work
have these
tomorrow morning and tell
stories.
Brandy I mentioned her name on the show.
Yes, she'll get to hear her name in a couple weeks when we
All right,
air this
I'll
one.
tell her that.
So thank you so much, Ed.
Yes,
You're
thank
very
you so
kind.
much.
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We thank you for taking time to join us today for this ordinary, extraordinary chat. To learn more about today's discussion, please visit our website, theordinaryextraordinarycemetery.com, where you will find additional links in our show notes. And if you're watching us on YouTube, be sure to give us a like and subscribe to our channel, The Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery Podcast. This really makes us more visible to others on YouTube who may also enjoy our podcast.
And please don't forget to visit us on social media, where we share all kinds of cemetery photos, quotes, tidbits, and more. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Ordinary Extraordinary Cemetery, and on X at Ord Extra Sim. So ORDEXTRACEM. If you enjoyed this or any of our episodes, please consider leaving a 5-star review and a comment on Apple's podcast, Spotify, or directly on our website. You can also leave those same comments on YouTube. Your positive reviews and enthusiasm for our show help others who love cemeteries and history to discover us and all of our ordinary, extraordinary stories. And if you're feeling extra generous and want to help support the podcast in a financial way, you can now buy Dianne and I a cup of coffee, either through YouTube or on our website. Simply click on the coffee cup icon and it will allow you to make a donation.
Until we meet again.